Good morning. There are still some joining, but in fairness to those who have already joined up, I think we'll go ahead. Paul O'Brien is my name, and I'm the MD of calQrisk, and I'd like to welcome you this morning to this, our first webinar to the charities and not-for-profit sector. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Gerry Joyce. Gerry is currently the chair of the Mirror Committee of the ISO 31000 Risk Management Standard on behalf of the NSAI. He represents Ireland on the technical committee of the standard, and has been involved in the risk management process, process excellence, governance, and associated compliance for now more than 15 years. And when we began to discuss general governance, risk and compliance issues with the charity not-for-profit sector, a couple of what we would describe as hot topics arose, and one of the hottest was evidencing compliance. That's providing evidence or having the evidence to demonstrate to the Charities Regulator and other regulators, the housing authorities and the Irish Sport, for example, having evidence of the governance. And that basically is the subject of our topic this morning. And with that, I will hand over to Gerry and come back to you later on. There is an opportunity at the bottom of the webinar, the bottom of the slide, to put in questions, answers. Sorry, we will answer those questions at the end of the session. We're scheduled here for about 30 minutes. So with that, I'll hand over to Gerry and come back to you when he's done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning. Thank you for that introduction, Paul. I'll move on straight on to my agenda. Okay. In a moment, I'll speak about who we are briefly. Paul has probably covered most of that. Then quickly, I'm going to go through what governance, I suppose what governance is, what others consider good governance and good management. And then we look at the requirements of the Charities Governance Code. Again, just summary to remind you what it is we're talking about today. You will be familiar with it. I'm going to introduce the concept of a maturity model, because something we've seen in other regulators, just an idea, just something you can start thinking about. Not more work for you, just how you might make things easy for yourself in the future. And then we look at the compliance record form, which the regulator has conveniently provided so you can record your evidence of compliance. And let's see how we would do that. And I would say storing the evidence in the evidence bag and collecting that is going to be the challenge. Okay. So to cover the bits maybe that Paul hasn't covered, yeah, we see ourselves as risk and compliance professionals in the first place. We're members of different organizations: the Institute of Risk Management, Institute of Bankers, Risk Management International Association, Compliance Officers of Ireland, Institute of Directors, Chartered Accountants, Information Security. Now, you might think we have loads of time on our hands to join these. Thankfully, a lot of these are virtual today, but we try to stay in touch with what's happening out there in terms of risk and compliance, such that we can reflect that then in our advice and in our product. Paul covered the standards one that I'm in, not 15, but maybe not far off it, maybe 14 years. Yeah, we have about 400 people using 400 regulated entities using the software. 200 of them are customers and 200 of them are customers of our customers. And you can see from the list a fairly broad spectrum of users, and they're using it to record and report on their risk compliance audit activity. Okay, that's us. I always like to have a quote up front or a definition in my webinars, and so I went to OECD, which was one of many that I had read over the years on corporate governance, particularly when studying risk management. And I thought their definition of what corporate governance is very succinct. Corporate governance provides the structure through which the objectives of the company are set and the means of attaining those objectives and monitoring performance are determined. And that's very succinct. That's to me put very well. Now, in the bullet points below, and you'll be familiar with this, other things that the board are responsible for, in terms of corporate strategy, plans, action, policies, procedures, budgets, conflicts of interest, and how they'll be prevented, how they'll be handled, and balancing competing demands in the organization. This is, the board is the referee, I see it, but they have an important role in overseeing the risk management. And we'll talk more about that later, the risk management system and other systems to ensure that the corporation is compliant. I mean, rule number one, be compliant with the laws and regulations that apply. And the board also have to be satisfied that the information on which decisions are being made is sound and coming from systems that are well managed and can be believed. I thought then closer to home I would take two quotes from one from the Charities Governance Code and the other from the Code of Practice for Good Governance in Sport Organisations. I like this one as well, the Charities one. Good governance involves putting in place systems and processes, or the arrangements if you wish, to ensure that your charity achieves its charitable objectives with integrity and is managed in an effective, efficient, accountable and transparent way. Again, that's succinct, and that we should all have in front of our eyes when looking at this subject in particular. The Code of Practice for Good Governance in Sport Organisations says, good governance is one where the board sets and oversees the achievement of its organisation's objectives. And you're beginning to see a theme here, I think, that it's about the objectives. Governance is not a means to an end. It is a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. The end is the objectives, and the governance is the means to achieving those objectives. That's what I want you to keep in mind. Okay. Now, when I was putting this presentation together, I had various titles on this slide. I was going to talk about good management, but I spoke with a friend in the Institute of Public Administration whose expertise is governance, and he described governance as an umbrella. And I thought, well, that's a good image. And if the Code of Practice for Good Governance in Charities is about, well, what does good governance look like? Look at what is happening in the charity, and think of the governance as the board has to ensure that it is happening and that it is happening well, it has been done well, and it is all towards the achievement of the objectives. So I describe it as, the governance in practice rather than the governance on paper. You can have all the policies you like, but if they're not actually applied and implemented, then you've only half the job done. So I could have populated this slide with a lot more activities that you do on a day-to-day basis, but I wanted to give you just a flavor for it. If you pick compliance, that's a big one, because there are lots of laws and regulations, whether it's health and safety or employment law, food safety, data protection. There are lots of laws and regulations you have to comply with, like every organization. And that's a key day-to-day activity, and the governance, the board have to ensure it happens, because otherwise you get closed down, not by the charity regulator, but by some other regulator. And the managing the risk, and this, maybe I'm picking these because this is the area we're in, but managing risk is not managing, events. A risk is not an event. A risk is, in the words of 31,000, the definition is the effect of uncertainty on your objectives. Now, it's the effect of uncertainty on the achievement of those objectives. Objectives aren't uncertain. And if they were certain, we could all go home now. Managing risk is managing that uncertainty to increase the likelihood of achieving your objectives. That's the way we see it, and that's the way risk is intended. So by managing the uncertainty around the objectives, you're managing the risk effectively. So let's now just quickly review the governance code and what it is that is expected of you as charities. And it's interesting that in the words of the regulator, they see this as a minimum standard. And please don't be offended if I say, I think there's nothing in the standard that anybody could argue with. I think it's reasonable. I think you're probably doing most of this before you were told, because a lot of you I know have or maybe volunteers in the charities and are working in other businesses or have worked in other businesses and will be familiar with a lot of these. So it's maybe motherhood and apple pie to you, but let's have a look. Advancing charitable purpose. The first principle. Yeah, have a clear purpose. First and foremost, know what it is you're trying to achieve. Agree a plan, and in the core standard is agree a plan for at least a year, and maybe larger charities have an eye on the future and are looking out 3 years, but have a plan at least for the next year. And make sure you have the resources to implement that plan. Maybe you have to adjust the plan to match the resources you do have, but yeah, it's know what you want to achieve and make sure you have the resources to achieve it, and monitor your progress. That on a monthly, quarterly basis, you're seeing, are you achieving the plan? Do you need to modify that? Behaving with integrity. This is important, particularly, well, always important, and particularly for charities. You agree values, the values that the employees, volunteers, the trustees are expected to comply with. It determines the behavior, as does the code of conduct more specifically. There will be conflicts of interest, conflicts of loyalties, just the nature of the business. You need to be clear on how you're going to deal with them. And I'm sure that is well covered in most organizations. Leading people, and I like this, leading people, not managing people. It is about leading people. And again, I've just picked out 4 of the standards here. Let them be clear on their roles and responsibilities. Do train them, support them, develop them when you're recruiting them and when you're bringing them into the organization, that they have all they need. You need robust policies and procedures to guide the activities. And this is guided by, again, the board will influence the policy directly. Principle 4 is about exercising control. And this is a key one, because an organization that doesn't exercise control goes out of control and will not survive very long. You could say they're all important, but I think this is one where you can quickly go out of business. And here we see compliance with the regulations. If you don't comply on a lot of these regulations, you're shut down, and it's not the charity regulator who will shut you down, as I said. Financial controls. You're handling other people's money who've donated to you. So the expectations are higher than most organizations, that you manage and control the finances. Manage the risks. I've spoken about this, I will again. You want to increase the likelihood of achieving your objectives, so identify the risks and manage those risks. Insurance cover, yeah, make sure you have the applicable insurances. We all want to work effectively, and professional managers among you will all know it's a combination of things, but having a good mix of skills in the first place, to cover all the requirements. Have regular board meetings, keep the train on the tracks. Having facts for decision making. Make sure you have enough information, not too much. Quantity is not quality, but have facts, have correct information when making decisions. That's important, and important that the systems that information comes from and processes, that they are sound. Review, if you're achieving the plan, review on an ongoing basis. It's part of that feedback loop. Make sure you stay on track. There's a lot of things you have to do here, and you can see a lot of things that will generate its own evidence. We'll see in a moment. And finally, the last principle, being accountable and transparent. Registered charity number. I was interested to see this on the list of standards, because if I get anything through the door from a supposed charity and it doesn't have an RCN, I ignore it. It goes straight in the bin. It's kind of the first thing. If it doesn't have that, then I can't, I'm not going to even see if they're a real charity. Communications, again, you're getting money from donors and funders. How are you going to communicate to them? How are you going to report to them how you're spending the money that they've donated? Do you want to involve stakeholders? That can help sometimes, a lot of times, but decide how you want to involve stakeholders and where it's appropriate. I think important, and this is having procedures for handling queries and complaints. And, you know, again, you're a charity, and people have donated money, so they're entitled, they would feel, and I think so, to send queries to you. So I think it's important, if you're going to get the money from the same people again next year, that you've thought about all of these things. Now, you have. I'm telling you your business, so please don't be offended. I just wanted to make sure that, yeah, we're all on the same page. Just one slide on maturity model. I do another webinar which has a lot more slides on maturity model, but I wanted to introduce a concept to you. The original idea of a maturity model was back in the 70s and furthered by Carnegie Mellon University, but it was a tool that helps people assess the current effectiveness of a person or group and supports figuring out, you know, the capabilities they need to acquire in order to improve performance. Now, the reason I put it up here is because other regulators we have seen have started introducing this concept, and they want people to be continually improving. So if 3 is kind of where most organizations are, they've got some defined processes and procedures under people, process, and technology. It's a good way to view it. When you get to that level, if you're serious about this, because it's a journey, you want to say, well, how can we get better? How can we improve? So I'm saying start thinking about it now, because in 2 or 3 years' time, you can be sure the regulator will up the bar a bit. So it's no harm to be thinking in those terms. Also, because the compliance code is a comply or explain rather than a comply or die, which is the alternative. And let me explain to that one. In America, their corporate governance code is you comply or you're struck off. In the UK and Ireland, our corporate governance codes tend to be comply or explain. And the Charities Corporate Governance Code, or Governance Code, is also of that nature, that if you're not doing something that's in the code, just explain. And the regulator is understanding. There will be good reasons, maybe. So on to the record form, where you're actually confirming to the regulator how that you are and how you are complying with the code. And I feel maybe there's a third column or a fourth column here, the explain one, that, okay, if you're not doing it, but you plan to do it, you can explain that in a fourth column. Let's have a look. I like mind maps, and what I'm going to do now is just going to take a few of the principles, and this one is advancing the charitable purpose. It's one of 6, and moving to the left, moving from right to left, that charitable purpose is supported by all the principles. There's 49 standards, and each principle has between 5 and 10 standards that you would need to apply the principle in your organization. So if we look at the standards that apply to advancing the charitable purpose, the code says you have to be clear about the purpose of your charity. Consider whether or not any private benefit arises. Agree an achievable plan for the next year. Make sure your charity has the resources, and review what you're doing. All very reasonable, but how do you evidence that? And this is where I'd like to take the first one, to be clear about the purpose, and let's look at how we might do that. In the sample completed form that the regulator includes in the documentation, they have conveniently given lots of suggestions as to how you might evidence compliance. Now, they say themselves that the list isn't exhaustive, and when it comes to compliance, certainly there's a lot more work to be done, but it certainly gives a good starting point. Now, in calQrisk, we've built on that starting point, and we've started writing questions, questions that you should ask yourself. And you may not do all of them, but certainly by going through an examination on each of these standards and asking yourself a bunch of questions, you will start to identify the evidence. And the purpose for me showing you beforehand about the governance and the what's involved in the day-to-day management, you are doing a lot of this, and there is a lot of evidence there, but it's, are you collecting it? And the time to collect it is, I guess, when you're doing it, and not a week before you have to submit that, that record form. So let's have a look. Have trustees, this is now being clear about the purpose of your charity. And again, this isn't an exhaustive list, this is a sample, but have the trustees read the regulator's guidance on what defines a charity? And you would say, your answer might be, well, yes, and we've collected the signatures of all trustees who've confirmed they have read what is a charity. It's part of our induction program, and we get them all to read it and confirm that they've read it and understood it. Does the charity's governing document elaborate on the charitable purpose? Well, you probably all have a constitution or a memo in arts that spells out what the charitable purpose is. Again, you have the evidence. You just need to get a copy of that, or maybe copy that section and have it in the evidence bag, as I would say. Have the trustees read and understood the governing document? And the governing document is your principal document. Well, you might say, again, it's part of the induction program. It's in the training outline. That's a bit of evidence. And then we get annual written confirmation that they have reviewed the document and understood it, because the document can change from year to year. So you might get that annual attestation that they've read and understood it. Are board members reminded of the main object at each board meeting? That's an easy one. Maybe it's a standing agenda item, something that you read out at the beginning of every board meeting. Again, you probably have a sample board agenda that you can put into the evidence bag. Does the annual report clearly state the charitable purpose and objectives of the charity? Surely it does. I would say it's a serious omission if it doesn't. Again, take a copy of that page of the report, include it in your evidence bag. Is the charitable purpose clearly documented on the charity's website? Websites are, in these days, more and more important for getting our message across, because we can't go out and shout it in the streets. Again, you probably have the page on your website, screenshot into the evidence bag. And this is again just a sample. If we take another principle 4, I think this one is, exercising control. There are, here I think I've picked 6 of the core standards. And again, there's probably, I think on this one, probably another 3 additional ones. But taking the 6 core, let's have a look. And exercising control, I think, is a hugely important one. Review the legal form and governing document for appropriateness. Yeah, I'm absolutely. They have to be aligned. Comply with laws and regulatory requirements that are relevant to the charity. Now, there's a good note, a general note on other legal and regulatory requirements that the regulator has circulated. I advise you to read that. This is a big chunk. This is a big chunk of what you have to do. And certainly if you're not compliant with all of the other laws and regulations, any one of them could just shut you down. So that needs undivided attention. Ensure adherence to fundraising guidelines. And there's another document that you have to comply with, the fundraising guidelines. Again, another bunch of work. Ensure appropriate financial controls in place. Hardly needs reminding. I see there's a Q&A. I'll take the questions maybe at the end. Identify and manage risks, something obviously close to my heart. Because this is something that I've been involved in for years. And let's have a look at that. And the last one here is, if I can, is insurance cover. Just one second. Okay. clearly you need to have applicable insurances in place to protect the public, protect your volunteers, your employees, and maybe the building insurance. But let's go back to the identify and manage risks. And I just want to drill down on that a little bit deeper. And again, from right to left, the standard is to identify and manage risks. And again, the regulator has a guide, which I'm not recommending, but I will just pick on these 6 items, 6 questions that would tell me if you are identifying and managing risks and can produce the evidence. Have you adopted a formal risk classification method? By that I mean, it's a fairly common practice that when people are recording risks, they record them in groups. You know, maybe it's a governance risk, or it's an operational risk, compliance risk. It's easier when reporting them if they're grouped together. It makes for a lot of sense, because a lot of the controls you put in place might go across multiple risks. So it's kind of logical to group them in terms of these categories. You might, when you're starting off in this risk management process, you know, take a top-down approach and say, well, let's decide on what the categories are, and let's get people to research risks in those categories. That might be in your documented risk management process document. A key document here is the policy. It's probably the first one I would do, have a risk management policy. Now, you're talking about a document of maybe 2 or 3 pages. If anybody's interested, we have a kind of a generic risk management policy document that we give out to people. If you need a starting point, a template as to what should be in a risk management policy. But it's basically saying, what are your objectives of the risk management? What are you going to do? Who's going to do it? How are you going to do it? And maybe in that is the next one, which is the amount and type of risk you're willing to take in pursuit of your objectives. And this is a tricky one. It's often referred to as risk appetite. And you might say, well, we've no appetite for risk at all. Not correct. You might have no desire, but it's not about risk avoidance. It's about risk awareness. It's about understanding the risks that exist. As soon as you agree on an objective, there are risks that threaten that objective. It's about managing those risks. But you need to agree at some level on how much risk you're willing to take. This is probably already embedded in a lot of your policies, things that you will do, that you won't do, limits that you would set. You know, it could be down to a detail, down to the maximum. The maximum you will invest in a project without some other partner, you know, of your own funds money. It might be down to the maximum somebody can sign off on a check. You know, there are, you know, a risk appetite statement is not one statement. It's probably a page of them. And it's of things you will do, things you won't do. Now, we have other articles that we can certainly share with you. And we do a webinar on risk appetite, and that takes about 30, 40 minutes. So, but do agree on your risk appetite, basically, on what things you will do and won't do in pursuit of your objectives. And it could be, you know, activities you will engage in, activities you won't engage in. They're all expressions of appetite. So you've got your policy, you've got your process document, but have you gone and identified the risks and agreed to the categories, under the agreed categories, and have you documented these? Now, the evidence might be a risk register. And depending on the size of the organization, you might have several risk registers that might be collated into one. The risk register is the obvious, easy evidence that you're managing the risk. And have the risks been analysed and evaluated to determine if any action is needed to mitigate them? Again, that can be shown on the risk register. You're showing the risk, you're showing what controls are in place, and maybe additional active actions that you're going to take to address the risk. That's good evidence, and easy to put into the evidence bag. Do you monitor the risks and confirm the effectiveness of controls? If you do an assessment on the 1st of January, you can arguably say that it's only valid for one day, for the 1st of January. And if it's now the middle of March, is that risk assessment still valid? Well, this is what monitoring and managing risk is about. Maybe there are things you need to check on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. to confirm that the controls are still working. You know, if you're handling cash and you have a particular procedure for how the cash is handled, does anybody check that that procedure has been followed to the letter? That's monitoring the controls. It's not checking whether people are honest or not. It's checking whether the controls are working and whether you need to modify them. Again, evidence maybe of that monitoring is evidence that you're managing the risk. So I hope I've given you a sample of the sort of things you are doing already, maybe not always seen it as evidence, and you can be collecting the evidence basically as you go. And then as you need it, you want to be able to quickly pull that evidence out of the evidence bag. Storing the evidence, well, because you need to be able to produce it maybe at will, paper is probably the least useful form. Yeah, certainly you'll have sign-in sheets and signed agreements and attestations, but why not scan them? Why not scan them as they happen and store it all on a server or servers? I recommend keeping at least one copy of the evidence, maybe offsite. If you get hit by ransomware and it spreads within your organization, then everything the ransomware can see has been corrupted and you won't get it back. You have to assume that. So always a good recommendation is to have a copy of your data, your important data, off the network. Off the network means that it's not visible from the network, let's say by ransomware, that it's pushed out to an external storage, safe, so that if you do get hit, at least you have a copy of your data safely. Again, we do another webinar on resilience, and that's one of the recommendations we'd make. But store it electronically in the bag so that when you need it to attach to your record form, you can quickly put your hand on it. You've probably got a feeling already for where that evidence will come from, but it's meeting agendas, it's minutes, it's training records, it's agreements, it's attestations, it's policies, it's procedures, it's reports, it's risk assessments, you know, quite a long list. In my slide earlier back, I was saying, you know, 6 principles, 49 standards, 32 if you're a small charity, and then 300 to 400 kind of questions you might ask yourself. So there is a lot of evidence available there. I would say identify it as you go and save it as you go, because you may be asked for that report and update at any time. If I was the board, I would maybe ask for evidence on a quarterly basis that we're compliant. This is, if you like, the one slide you might consider as a sales page, but I just want to give you an idea of how this can be done with questions. We do this, we ask questions, and then we have let's say a report. You can press a button on, click view, and get a report in the format that the regulator says. So you have the actions, and then you have the evidence of the actions already articulated if you're collecting it and storing it as you go. Okay. I'm going to leave it at that. I think there are some questions, and I'm happy to take them now. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Gerry.
Okay.
Actually, relatively few questions. There's some people asking if they could have a sample risk policy. So we can certainly send that to anybody who shows an interest in it and wants it.
Paul, I would say the one we have is generic in any organization. If there's a lot of interest in this, we might try and make a generic one for charities, because this is a generic one for every organization. So if there's a lot of interest, happy to work on that one as well and get a second generic one, if you like, specific to charities.
Okay.
I've just signed up for more work. Yeah.
There's another question here that talks about risk appetite and a webinar, and we certainly there's it's something that we have done in the past, and I'm sure we'd be happy to do it. But what we might do is we might send out to the sector maybe some kind of a survey to see who'd be interested in what. Gerry talked about resilience, risk appetite. I know is a hot topic. So we'll see if we can find those hot topics and commit to roughly every, I'm going to say every 2 months or so, come back with a webinar that addresses some of those. The other issue that came up here was a question about whether we would send a slide deck. And yes, in the next, I'm going to say before the close of business tomorrow, Friday, we will have contacted everybody with the slide deck and a little bit of information about calQrisk. Generally, we don't sell at these webinars, and we like to keep to that principle, because oftentimes they are actually CPD approved webinars. But certainly we will send on the general literature about our product and offering. A question here, Gerry, for you. Any idea what time, hours per week, month, year, might be required to comply for charities of various sizes? That's how long is a piece of string question, so I'll pass that to you.
Hours, weeks, months, years might be required to comply for a charity. Well, I think if you're doing a lot of this every day, and it's what I was saying was, if you don't wait till you have to fill out that record form, then you can be collecting it as you go. The information now, when you say comply, what's not said there is comply with the governance code or comply with all of the things you have to comply with, because I'll tell you what is a lot more work is to comply with all of the other regulations. You know, if it's data protection, health and safety, employment law, food safety, you know, if you're providing support or benefit to minors, there are other laws and regulations you have to comply with, and they'll certainly take an awful lot more time. But if the question is about complying with the governance code, I would say initially to set up something like this, you know, to set up the structures such that you're gathering the evidence, you might be talking about I will say days, 5 to 10 days in the first few months, man days to set it up. But on an ongoing basis, then you're talking about hours per week. You know, I think you just need to be collecting the evidence as you go. And that would be my feeling. But ask me again in 6 months' time. I'm just looking at the questions as well, Paul. I don't know if you've scrolled down. There's quite a few. Some standard template job description for compliance officer. That might be one that Fiona, I know, who's on the call. A job description for a compliance officer. Fiona is our. She's a member of the Association of Compliance Officers of Ireland. We might be able to dig something out on that. How often should a small charity be expected to fully review its compliance documents? Again, if we're talking about compliance with the governance code, generally these things you might be asked once a year. But if you're a board member of that, why would you wait until the end of the year to find out if you're compliant? I mean, what I would tend to do is I would say take each principle, and every 2 months take maybe a different principle, and make sure you're complying with that principle, rather than waiting till the end of the year and trying to do it all in one go. But I would say my feeling is once a year, but don't do it all in the 1 week. Okay. You get better engagement, I'd say, if you pick one every 2 months or so. And
if anything changes, Gerry, you know, change from change management point of view.
Is that my speaker? You're very low.
I just wanted to add the point that if anything changes between your review times, so
that's a very good point. I mean, it's people ask me, like, how often should you assess a risk? And my answer to that is always, well, when anything changes. If nothing changes, the environment around the risk, then there's probably no need. Certainly, yes, if you change your purpose, if the laws change, that should be a trigger for you certainly to review your compliance. Always. Thank you for that, Fiona. Anonymous attendee, what type of risk register management software is available for larger charities? Well, yeah, we'll write to us and we'll happily answer that. I would like a copy of the risk policy. Yeah, happy to copy. A lot of requests for the policy template. Brian says, I've come from a world with strict compliance. Some charities have limited numbers of staff. How do you effectively manage risk with limited admin staff? That is going to be a challenge, Brian. Certainly we see that we have a lot of small charities in Ireland who will look at this compliance code and think, oh my God, and will I survive? We only have a small number of people. That is a challenge. I note that the regulator did put in one of the principles encouraging maybe the charities should cooperate with each other's, maybe not so much emerge as maybe it's a shared resource. I would say you cut your cloth to suit. If you have a low number of staff, then you're limited in what you can do. Don't set your plan, the bar and what you want to achieve too high, because as you say, you're limited by staff. In the comply or explain, you have some scope to explain to the regulator, well, we don't do that because we don't have the people, so that will get you out of some of those. But nobody will excuse you for not complying with the law. And there are a number of laws you will have to comply with. So yeah, it's going to be certainly a challenge for charities with low numbers of staff. I don't have the magic answer for that, but perhaps, multiple charities could share a resource. If you need advice on something, if you need advice on employment law, that in your small charity, then hopefully, there's a collection that can do it once and 10 charities can share from that work. Terence, I felt that you implied that evidence of compliance is to be attached to your compliance return. However, I thought of the charity is only required to have it available if the regulator requests the evidence. Okay, I always read it as you might have to attach it, but that's fine if you don't have to attach it, but you'd still keep it in the evidence bag so that if they do come knocking, you know where to find it. That's fine. And maybe you don't have to attach 50 files to the report. Maybe you just have to say we have it. I did note in the sampled reply that for smaller charities, the regulator seems to accept. We had a meeting and we discussed it, and that was enough of evidence. I would say that is probably fine for small charities. Certainly for larger charities, the regulator will say, "Now show us the evidence in practice." To the Brian, was it who asked about how you expected? It might be that it's the requirement is much lower when you look into it. Violet, I would say policy. Okay, Brian. Okay. I'm going to ask Paul and maybe Fiona if there's any there that I've missed. Quite a few have come in. A lot of people interested in the generic risk policy.
Yeah, I think you've covered you've covered most of the questions, and we'll deal with the requests for documentation for the various materials that we have, and happily share that. So we'll get back to those directly, and anybody who wants to send us an email, we're available at inquiries@calqurisk.com, or a lot of you will already have had mails from me as I've reached out to in the course of this webinar, so you can come back to me directly also, or indeed to Gerry. I think for what we're seeing, there is enough interest in these in the webinar and in the general topic for us to be encouraged to continue to do them. So I think we will commit to that.
Yeah.
And we're available. So if you've got anything, feel free to send us any comment or inquiry anytime. In the next couple of weeks, we will probably reach out to you to see if we can be of any assistance to you with calQrisk. And basically what the system does is helps to make the process of governance, risk and compliance more efficient. And that will save the question that Brian asked, by making things more efficient and sometimes just cleaning out or systemizing some of the things that burn the day. That might be of interest. So certainly we know from our experience that people who struggle with spreadsheets to manage risk registers, we have a paper on that if you want to go on our website and find it. Sometimes struggling with spreadsheets burns a lot a day. Our system can automatically generate the risk register from the input at the push of a button. So that's the kind of thing that might improve it. Make it an easier burden. But the reality is, it's like the tax compliance. You find a way to do it. You won't survive as a business if you don't do it. So find a way to do it, and then see if you can find ways and talk to people who are doing it better. And I know that there are organizations out there, the Charities Institute and others, who are available to help. And there are those collectives that can help both to make the process more efficient and the cost more affordable. I suppose bear in mind that we tend to talk a lot about the Charities Regulator, but the truth is we know that the housing associations have a regulatory responsibility as well, as do the sporting bodies. So the principles behind what we're talking about here are pretty much all the same. Gerry says, put it in the evidence bag. If anybody asks, you have it, and keep it as up to date as you can, and systemize that. It's all about systemize. It's about knowing that your controls, the key controls, are in place and effective. I think for now, at least, the charities, all of the regulators associated with charities and not-for-profits are fair regulators. So they will wait to hear the explanation before they take any action. But obviously, if they find something that is so in breach, they have a responsibility to the society as well, and they will act. So they are a credible threat of enforcement, and we have to take them seriously.
Okay.
Okay. I think we've burned a lot of the day. Very interesting question sets and a very active group, and we are both surprised and delighted with the number of people who have come today. And we hope you found it useful. Hope you found it interesting. And in the next, I'm going to say, by close of business tomorrow, you will all have received the slide deck, and we'll tell you a little bit about calQrisk. The response to requests for other materials we'll deal with as they come in on a one-by-one basis, but we'll commit to doing it, and we are delighted to be so heavily engaged with the sector. But with that, I think, Gerry, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for your attendance.
We'll keep you posted on the next webinars. We have a newsletter that will be a sectoral newsletter that we would propose to put out maybe it's an occasional thing, every couple of months. And in the course of our engagement with you, we will seek your permission to include you on that list. So again, thank you very much. And we'll keep in touch.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.